back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the previous lecture, I talked about one of the most tragic events of that year, or any year, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In this lecture, we'll conclude our discussion of civil rights by talking a little bit about what happens to the civil rights movement in the aftermath of King's death. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, planned a nationwide march on Washington on April 22, 1968, to focus the nation's attention on this issue, and particularly to pressure Congress to pass legislation to address the employment and housing issues. Unlike earlier marches, SCLC leaders planned the creation of what they called Resurrection City, a giant tent city on the Mall in Washington, D.C., where demonstrators would remain until their demands were met. When Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, movement leaders debated whether to go forward with the planned demonstration. They chose to continue the march with King's lieutenant, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, as its new leader. The march date was postponed until May 12th, though a few hundred people arrived in Washington on the original date. The first week, May 12th through 29th, brought a wave of nearly 5,000 demonstrators. During the second week, Resurrection City was completed. The protesters represented people from a wide range of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Native Americans from reservations, Latinos from the Southwest, impoverished whites from West Virginia, as well as rural and urban blacks. They all came together and spread the message of the campaign to various federal agencies. They also disrupted life in Washington to try and force the government to respond. At its peak, the number of protesters reached nearly 7,000, but still fell far short of the expectation of 50,000 people. The march was also marred by weather and leadership divisions. An unusual downpour of rain made the ground turn to mud, causing the tents to weaken and eventually forcing people to leave. Tension among the demonstrators themselves caused violent outbreaks and undermined the effectiveness of the leadership. People began to refer to it as the Little Bighorn of the civil rights movement. One writer described it as, quote, some grotesque soap opera whose run could not end soon enough. And finally, it has been called, quote, almost a perfect failure. The assassination of Robert Kennedy on June 5th sealed the fate of the campaign. Andrew Young said, "We were all still trying to pretend that Martin's death had not devastated us. But with Kennedy's shooting, I couldn't pretend anymore. I sank into a depression so deep it was impossible to go on." Resurrection City closed 2 weeks later, on June 19, 1968. James Earl Ray, meantime, had been on the run since the shooting itself. Immediately after firing his shot, he sprinted from his room and ran from the flophouse. With law enforcement already on the move, he ditched the rifle and a number of other items, jumped in his car, and drove like a bat out of hell straight into the night. As law enforcement set up ever-widening roadblocks extending out from the city, Ray managed to stay just ahead of the checkpoints. He drove to Atlanta, then took a bus to Cincinnati, then Detroit, and then on to Toronto in Canada. He adopted a number of aliases and threw together a plan to go to Rhodesia in Africa. He flew to London, and then Portugal, and then back to London again. The manhunt to find Ray became the largest such operation in American history, with some 3,000 FBI agents working the case. Piece by piece, investigators drew closer to finding Ray, tracking down every lead and recreating both his stalking of King prior to the murder and his flight after the murder. Eventually, Ray was detained on June 8th in London, trying to board a flight to Brussels, Belgium, where he hoped to find passage to Rhodesia. He was then sent back to the States and put on trial. As the nation remained transfixed throughout this process, they also wondered, as historians have for decades, why had he done it? Ray seems to have been motivated by several things. First and foremost, simply racism and hate. He was a follower of George Wallace and worked for his campaign. Wallace was running for president in 1968 on a platform of segregation. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever was his campaign slogan. Martin Luther King had said of Wallace, "I'm not sure he believes all the poison he preaches, but he is artful enough to convince others that he does." Ray also seems to have been motivated by a desire to be famous. He was a loner, a recluse, easily forgotten by most everyone who met him, and yet he also desired fame and recognition. Is it possible that he was also motivated by money? Perhaps. There were any number of wealthy individuals and or hate groups that had put a bounty on King's head. However, there's no evidence connecting Ray directly to any of those groups or to any specific bounty that he collected. He may have thought he would receive a bounty if he carried out the crime, but if that contributed to his motivation, he was disappointed afterwards. As far as we know, he never got any money. FBI reports continued to insist that he acted alone. As one report said, "Some Americans don't want to believe that one miserable person can bring such tragedy on our country and impact so powerfully on the destiny of us all." For his part, after his capture, Ray confessed to the murder and was convicted to 99 years in prison. He later recanted the confession and implicated another man. A few times through the years, there were attempts to convict a co-conspirator, which were not successful, although Martin Luther King's family did eventually win a civil suit against a man named Lloyd Jowers, a Memphis restaurant owner, as part of a conspiracy. They were awarded $100 in that settlement. Ray escaped from prison briefly in 1977, and then later died in prison in 1998 from hepatitis C. In the wake of King's death, there were many who argued that he should not have died in vain, and that his causes continued to need to be followed through and action needed to be taken. Among those was President Lyndon Johnson, who immediately put pressure on Congress to pass additional legislation, most pointedly what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or the Fair Housing Act. Johnson wanted the measure passed immediately, even before King's funeral on April 9th. They missed that deadline by a single day, but Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968 on April 10th, due immediately to the pressure applied in the aftermath of King's death. Congress had debated another civil rights bill related to housing for several years, in fact. Housing was one of the issues that had not been resolved by the original Civil Rights Act of 1964 or Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it was well documented that there were patterns of racism in the housing system throughout the country. Another growing issue during this time were the number of veterans returning from Vietnam or soldiers serving in Vietnam, many of whom were African American or minorities, and who found themselves unable to find adequate housing, either after they returned or their spouses and families if they didn't return at all. But it took King's death to force this measure through. Ultimately being adopted, the measure prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rent, or finance of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. The measure went into effect under Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, who we'll talk about later in the course. Nixon selected the governor of Michigan, George Romney, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And for a time, there was great fanfare over this measure and the improvements that it introduced. They implemented April as Fair Housing Month, and for a time, the entire country honored April with this recognition. The Department of Housing and Urban Development continues its activism to this day, one of the lasting impacts of King and his life. Civil rights organizers were shocked and stunned into disbelief after King's death. With their leader removed, there were grave questions regarding the directions that the movement would take. And the traditional line of scholarship has it that the civil rights movement as an organized being ended in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King. Indeed, the movement does fragment after King's death. But more recent historians and scholars, rather than declaring the civil rights movement ended in 1968, refer to it as rather a kind of turning point or changing point, where many other elements of the movement begin to take root. King's brother, at the end of the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, announced, "This is just the beginning." This is just a few weeks after King's death. And in some ways, he was right. This was the beginning of new directions for the civil rights movement. Much of what occurs in the months and years after King's death is the implementation and the adoption of measures that were enacted during his lifetime, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so there were great efforts and progress made in breaking down barriers in job segregation in the aftermath of King's death. College campuses became a seedbed and a hotbed of black activism in the aftermath of King's death, much as they had been before. But this was an era when black history programs and African American studies programs were flourishing, and other benefits and equality were being achieved on college campuses around the country. Blacks also saw great gains in the military, where, while they still struggled against segregation and discrimination in some cases, there was a broader sense of equality, and we began to see much more frequently an atmosphere in which white soldiers might look to authority and leadership from black officers. There are also a spate of black organizations springing up around the country, one of the most notable being the Congressional Black Caucus, which was originated in 1969 and started by the woman pictured at the bottom on the screen, Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman elected to Congress in 1968. She was a Democrat from New York. This demonstrated the growing voice of blacks in leadership positions and elected positions all around the country. And finally, we continued to see flourishing in the aftermath of King's life, just as we had seen during his life, a growing celebration of black literature, the arts, theater, music, dance, and black history as well. African and African American styles became very much in vogue in American society, particularly during the 1970s. Despite all of these gains, African Americans continued to confront very real and challenging obstacles in American life. The challenges of housing discrimination and segregation continued to persist despite the gains made in 1968. Poverty, police brutality, inequalities in education, and so on continued to confront blacks throughout the country. They also confronted, as I mentioned, the growing backlash from white conservatives in the country, which came to be symbolized by the election of Richard Nixon in the 1968 presidential election, and later by the presidency of Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980. In fact, as we've gone through these lectures on 1968, many listeners might have been thinking to themselves, this sounds an awful lot like the same kind of issues confronting our society today. And indeed, one of the great conundrums of 1968 and the life and career of Martin Luther King Jr. is that for all of the victories and accomplishments from that time period, we still continue to confront many of the same pressing issues in our society today.